And that's a holdover from Roman and Greek mythology, actually. But, guess what? I had such a fun time last time enacting Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I'm going to do that this time again. So, this is what we're going to do. Okay, so I'm Dante. Let's get that clear. I am in a dark and dreary wilderness. Our life, right? Not any of my life, not your life. Our life, not our lives, actually. Our life. Notice the verbiage there. Caught in midway through his life, right? So he's like having a midlife crisis, right? He might want to buy a car or take out, or I don't know. But like he's midway through his life, which he was, by the way. And Dante, and he's walking, and then all of a sudden he's realizing that, oh wait, I'm in a wood, aren't I? You know, it's like what is it? It's like Into the Woods. You know, you've seen Into the Woods. Who's seen Into the Woods? You've seen Into the Woods. Into the Woods. Into the Woods. Into the Woods. The woods is a big metaphor for what it is here, and it's an elaboration of being lost, right? It's an elaboration of ambiguity, of confusion, of lostness, in other words. And like you've been lost before. Sometimes it's fun to get deliberately lost. Have you ever done that?
So fun.
It's fun to get deliberately lost. Unless you have too good of a memory and you can't get deliberately lost, you know? That can be a problem. I'm not one of those people. But you try to get deliberately lost, and in a certain sense you have to get deliberately lost in order to, you know, like, have fun, you know. If you're too tightly structured, you just want to kill yourself. Not that. It's like Dostoevsky just said at one point that if we made everything perfect in a society, people would slaughter other people in the streets just to have something to do, right? And so we need an element of chaos, of lostness. But he's lost in the wilderness, and he's like, wait a minute, I'm lost. It's all dark here. I can't find anything. There's no orienting path. You know, it's like the mist of darkness, you know, in the Book of Mormon. You remember that. You remember that. But, you know, and he doesn't have an iron rod, first of all. So he's waking up to the fact that he's lost, okay? He's waking up to the fact that he's lost, but in a certain sense, at the moment, he's like, oh, I'm in the forest. He's like, I'm lost. And then because he realizes that he's lost, you know, he realizes that the darkness of the forest is dark. He goes over, and he sees a little beam of light. He's like, oh, there's a light. That's fun. So he goes to walk towards it, and then there's a leopard that's like, what is it, a leopard? It's a leopard. It's like, you aren't getting past here. You know, it's like, but it's interesting because the leopard actually isn't pursuing him, right? The leopard isn't pursuing him. It's just guarding the place. And so what this reminds me of, and I think I've heard people say this about this story, it's like, well, what appears to him at the top of the hill? What appears? Anybody remember? It's light, right? Just the sun, right? I could get the thing out. I'm actually going to get the thing out because it would be good to have the book handy. Let's see. It's this nice Barnes & Noble one. See this one?
Wow.
Owen Wilson, wow. Let's see. But after I had reached a mountain's foot, at that point where the valley terminated, this valley, this lost in the valley of the shadow of death, right? That's what this wood is. It's into the valley of the shadow of death, into the valley of the shadow of death. You know, it's like, I beheld its shoulders vested already with that planet's rays which leadeth others right by every road, okay? I think, yeah, and I'm talking about the sun, actually. Yeah, that's confusing, so I should have clarified. Let's see. But, and then he realizes that there is this leopard here preventing him from going up. And so it's like, really what's happening here is that he's found a light, right? He's found a guiding point. And it's a guiding point at the top of a hill, right? But guiding points at the top of the hill, right? Like if you're lost in like a forest and there's a hill without any forest on it, where do you want to go?
To the top.
You want to go to the hill, right? You want to go to the hill, but more specifically, what you want to do when you're lost is you want to get to a high vantage point, right? It says in Scripture, it's like, what does it say in the beginning of the Isaiah chapters about mountains? Anybody remember the first few verses of the Isaiah chapters? Anybody?
Get thee up on the mount.
It's like, no,
it's saying something about like, get the or
nations, right?
Nations
will want to go up to the mountain, and they'll beat their sword into plows and spears and pruning hooks, right? That's what's going on here. There's lots and lots and lots of metaphors all throughout the Bible, all throughout the Book of Mormon, about mountains being a metaphor for a divine state, right? And like you've been, who's climbed a mountain before? You've climbed a mountain before, I haven't. But like, what is it like?
Pretty cool.
Cool, like temperature-wise?
Both.
Okay, well, what's the other way? How is it cool not in terms of temperature?
Well, just like you get awesome sights.
It's the awesome sights, right? So if you are down below in like Utah Valley, like somewhere in an alley in Provo, there's only one genuine alley in Provo, by the way. I don't know, I've heard about it, but like there's just one. So if you're like in the city streets in Provo, you're like on Center Street or wherever, you can't see Utah Valley. There are buildings in the way. But if you're up at the Y, or you're at the top of 10th, you can see the whole dang thing, right? So it's like Dante wants to get to this top, right? He wants to get to the point where he can see everything, where he can surmount it, you know? And climbing a mountain is hard, isn't it? It's hard, it's super hard. And so it takes arduous effort. You remember the story in Genesis of Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah.
Anybody? So what happens to Lot's wife when she looks back? She turns into a pillar of salt. It's kind of the same thing that's going here, because they're leaving the city, and it specifically says they're going toward a mountain. But what's going on there, right, is that, well, when she looks back, she's looking back at the thing she's escaping from. That's clear. I actually don't think that's a symbol for looking back towards sin. And here's why. Looking at sin, in a certain sense, is the only way that you can prevent it from happening. I mean, you should look to God, right? But I think what this particularly means, this story in Abraham, no, not in Abraham, like in Genesis, is it's talking about how do I express this? Like, you know that moment when you're like giving a speech in front of a group of people, like say like 30 people, and then like maybe you do that every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then maybe what you're doing is you are trying to communicate something intuitive, something kind of not ephemeral, but like deep inside you, something imminent, something that is not spoken, right? And you can do it, but if you wonder if the words are right, if you wonder if the words you're saying are the right words, you'll lose your way, and you won't be able to say what you need to say. You'll just start reciting cliches or reciting, you'll say, oh, what I meant by that was, or really what I mean by that is, you're not having the confidence in the intuitive motions, the intuitive through motions, and I'm doing it right here. I'm doubting myself. I'm doubting the right words. But really, to me, what this going up toward the mountain, at least in Genesis, symbolizes, what does it mean? It means the capacity to see everything from the state where all thoughts are below and all feelings are above. Because all thoughts come from feelings, by the way. When I'm doing this, I'm speaking from feeling. When I'm doing this, I'm speaking from the intuitive part of me, the part of me that can order the words together, not the words themselves. I'm not lost in the words. It's like, into the words, it's like, no, that's actually what Into the Woods is, by the way. It's like no, I think I can do the monologue from Into the Woods that I did in high school, actually. I was the narrator. Of course I was the narrator. But what, how did it go? This for today, for tomorrow, and extended ever after. I don't remember it, never mind. Let's see. But it's lots of words, and the words are the woods. You're lost in the woods, you're lost in the words. You've been lost in words before. You know what that's like. You can't find the right words, and it's like it's not fun. But in a certain sense, I think that what Sodom is and what this wood is it's lost in the inessential. Lost in what doesn't make sense because you can't get a bird's eye perspective. But that's a lot about just a few lines, right? What he's doing right here is he's trying to get to a broader perspective, right? He's trying to get to that intellectual perspective. But there's this frickin' animal that's preventing him from doing it. And you also know what that's like, I'm sure. Because basically what's going on, right, is that, well, what does it say in the book of Romans? I think it's chapter 8. The one that sounds like Dr. Seuss. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe? It's like the good that I would do that I don't do.
Oh.
The good that I wouldn't do that I do. Basically he's saying what I want to do I can't, what I don't want to do, that is what I end up doing, right? And so really what we're talking about is a distinction between two principles, and these are actually all over medieval philosophy in which Dante would have imbibed: the will and the intellect. So, like, essentially, right? I think this actually works pretty well neuroscientifically if you interpret it a certain way, which a lot of them didn't. So this is like the right hemisphere of the brain. This is the left hemisphere of the brain. I mean, not the way they interpreted it, maybe, but I think it works pretty well if you interpret it a certain way. The will is what drives the car, you know? According to Swedenborg, anyway, who also uses this principle, the will is what survives after death. This goes away. He says that in the spiritual world, they can't remember names. Like, they don't have any concept of an earthly name. They just have quality, will, emotion. The intellect is necessary here. No saying it isn't necessary, but it's not sufficient. It comes first, but it's not the point, like the foundation of a house. And so when he's over here, he's trying to get to that broad perspective. He's like, yes, I'm going to overcome this sin. I'm going to get a broad perspective, and then you fall into it again. And you fall into it. You know, you've been that before. You all have your favorite sins, I'm sure. You know, it's like you get to the top of the, you try to get to the top of the mountain. It's like, you're not going there. And so he's forced back into the woods, you know, and then he goes into the woods, and then, because basically what he's depicting here is that struggle. He's depicting the struggle between what you want to do, what you know you should do, and what you end up doing is what another part of you wants to do. And that other part of you is the animal, the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf. And traditionally, by the way, the lion, the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf are depicting the three categories of sin that Dante will come up against later. But, so he goes down from the hill and he meets Virgil. And Virgil's basically saying, you know, he's like, you're so lost that we had to make a special provision to save you in a different way, right? Because that's basically what he's saying. And he's saying that, like, I'm going to take you, because you can't go up the normal way, right? We're going to take you down to get out. We're going to take you through to get out. We're going to make you go up by going down, which is actually a very Christian idea. You know, it's like Christ's harrowing of hell. You've heard of that idea. Or like Christ preaching to the dead. It's that same principle. It's that we need to go to the bottom of all things to rise above all things. That's in the Doctrine and Covenants. Descend below all things to rise above all things so that you can comprehend all things. What does comprehend mean, by the way? Other meanings. Like, what is its most literal spatial meaning? Anybody know?
Like comprehensive?
To catch all the things together.
Yeah, to encircle, to like put it in a single thing, right? Big bag, you know? To comprehend all things, to encircle all things. And so he's going, and that's basically what Virgil says, is Virgil says to Dante, he says that there's a lady up there, you know, way up there, past the clouds and the stars, who says that she is so admiring of you that she wants to help you overcome your difficulties. That's actually something that is true, by the way. Prayer helps. Lest you think that prayer doesn't help. Well, first of all, it's all over in the Book of Mormon, right? In the Book of Mormon, they say, an angel basically says the same thing that's going on here. Because of your father's prayers, I'm coming to help you. Wouldn't happen otherwise, right? Which is an interesting principle. It's basically like, how does it the case that, like, a prayer makes God do something that he wouldn't have done otherwise? Well, maybe it's because God works through people. Maybe because the prayer's desire is God's desire. I don't know. Certainly the most effective prayers for me are the ones that just come out of my mouth. Almost as if God needed my mouth to articulate the desire and make it real. I get that impression sometimes. Or God's hands, God's feet, God's mouth. And so he's there and he's saying, the issue, right, is that you aren't going to go up. You have to go down. And that's a true principle, you know. Like in the Potomac River, for instance. You know where the Potomac is, anybody? Anybody know where the Potomac is?
Maryland?
In Maryland, yeah. That's probably true about lots of other rivers too, but there's a like kayakers there know, I just heard this from someone who lives around there, that there are currents, they're called keeper currents. Anybody know about those?
They just like hold you in one spot.
So the idea, at least as she expressed it, is that if you resist the current, you'll drown, right? You have to go down with the current and go back up, right? And that's terrifying, but that's basically what's going on here is that he has to go down. I was listening to a lecture by Richard G. Scott. No, it was not a lecture, a general conference talk. No, shows you what I listen to a lot. I was listening to a conference talk with Richard G. Scott where he says basically the same principle. He says, the only way out is through. And that's what I was talking about last time, is that if you have your favorite sin, well, the reason you have your favorite sin is because you're unwilling to sit with it. You're unwilling to be present with it. You're unwilling to go through it. And that's what Dante's doing. He's going through hell. He's going into the hell he's ignored. We've all ignored. He's going into the bottom, the terrifying thing lurking beneath so that he can come up at the top. And that's an interesting thing, by the way, we'll get to at the end of the Inferno. We're going to do a few chapters of the Purgatorio, but there is almost no time spent covering Dante's reascent out of hell. It happens almost instantaneously. So Dante, in its essence, goes from the very top of hell to the very bottom center of hell, and that is the place where he leaves it. Which is interesting. And so he goes into hell, right? Dante goes with Virgil into hell. And above the door it says, in essence, right, abandon all hope. This is a hopeless place. And that typically, that's been hard for people to hear, right? It's been hard for people to hear. It's like Catholic mothers despairing that their children are going to hell because they didn't get baptized, right? Which is an awful thing. But like, let's take that a different way. Let's say that the thing that makes you go to hell is not having any hope. Perhaps. Perhaps. Because, like, what are the three things? It's hope, then
Charity and love.
Charity and faith, right? Faith, charity, and hope. They're all three of them are gifts, right? All three of them are things given to you by God without you earning it. But he's always wanting to give them to you. It's just a matter of whether you'll receive it. So it's a complicated dance. Like I use the metaphor of a cat, right? It's not unlike getting a cat to come to you. You have to make yourself open. But it's not just sufficient to make yourself open. The cat has to trust you. But God has perfect knowledge and knows when to trust you. But in a certain sense, right, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Maybe what it's saying is that here you have rejected God, and you have rejected your connection with God, and your connection with God is hope, right? It says, I think somewhere in Romans, I think, that everything works well for those who trust God, right? Anybody remember that? Yeah, everything works well for those who trust God. It doesn't say everything works well for those who don't, right? Which is an interesting idea. Certainly doesn't mean that nothing bad will happen to you if you trust God. That happens too. But I actually do firmly believe that things, if you trust God, will work for your best good in a way that they don't if you don't. And that may mean you get into a disease. A family member dies. But I actually do believe that things will happen meaninglessly. So there will be more meaningless suffering to the extent that you don't trust God, I believe. It may be less suffering, in fact, if you don't trust God, but it will be more meaningless, I think. So he goes into hell, the place where there's no hope. And that, really what that's saying, right, is that you're going, like, I know this is something that happens to people, especially people who are truly committed to living good lives. In fact, this happens only to people who are really committed to living good lives. You reach points when you think all hope is lost. When you can't think good thoughts. You can't think any thoughts. You're overwhelmed by negativity in your head. You're overwhelmed by the attacks of your self-criticism, your self-hatred, the voices that tell you you're not good enough, you're just lousy, right? And you're just overwhelmed by them, and it's so painful. And you feel hopeless. You feel absolutely hopeless. You feel like Christ at the last moment when he says that, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Right? Why have you left me alone? And the truth is, it's just those moments when God is closest. This is an interesting thought, and it doesn't seem like it, but it's true. Here's why. If you are in negativity, purely in evil, and I've said this before, if you're purely in evil, purely in harmful desires, because that's what evil is, it's harmful desires to you and to others. If you're purely in that, you're going to love it, right? Evil people, unredeemable evil people love doing what they do, right? They don't get as much pleasure out of it as a good person would if they're completely purified, but they love doing it, right? If you're in this state, it's because the negativity slumbering in you is being worked toward the surface. And the only one who can do that is God, in a certain sense. And so in a certain sense, when you were in that state, the only reason you're able to fight against it at all is because you have God there. And God is working more than at other times. So God is closer to you when you're in that state. Because if you're in that state and you don't give up, and what that means is you trust God, you'll be better afterwards. And this is a universal principle. This is a universal principle. You'll be in a better spiritual state afterwards. It seems hopeless. It seems necessarily hopeless at the time. And you need to get to a state of hopelessness. This state, Swedenborg would call it a temptation, right? But it's also called the dark night of the soul. Starts out as a feeling of anxiety, right? A kind of a doubt, right? Just like, do I really know this? Do I really know I'm a good person? And the doubts start to sprout, right? Like a negative version of the seed planted in your heart in Ellen 32 starts to sprout. And then it overwhelms you, right? Then you can't fight a bit against it, and then you're suddenly lost in the woods, right? You're lost in the woods. And then you're like, I can't do anything, right? And you just kind of loosen, right? You loosen and you say, I don't know. But you trust God and you do what's good anyway. And in that moment, when you're rid, especially of the selfishness lurking in your desire to do good, like you separated from it, because that's what happens, right? You just do it because there's no other reason to than you need to, you know? And then at that moment, the waters start to lessen, right? And that's the flood story too. But here, he's going into hell, right? He's going into hell. And the first people he meets are the people who were, you know, they were spectators, basically, right? There are people who didn't take sides. There are people who remain neutral in times of moral crisis. To use the words of Dr. Martin, I think it's Dr. Martin Luther King who said that, Jr. But it's like, you all know those types of people, the types of people who think, I'm just going to watch and let this play out, you know? Never mind the fact that there are people suffering that you could help if you spoke out, that if you did something. There are people suffering who you could help if you stood up for something. And I actually don't think that it's best to do something by speaking. Certainly that helps sometimes. Other times it makes things worse. But if you, for instance, there was a guy I went to a lecture for, and he was basically saying that he was this mystical, he was a philosopher of mysticism, basically, right? And he had this mystical experience as he was leading his lecture hall in India, and he saw a leper on the ground. He said, and I may have told this to you before, but some voice inside him told him that all your intellectual theories, all of your ideas are worth nothing if you don't help this man right now. Right? And if he just decided to leave him aside, then he would be in that first level of hell, right? But I think what he did is he lifted him up or something, I don't know, or he helped him in some way. So what ends up happening, he's in this place, and what they're following is a fleeting banner, right? A banner that goes here and there and here and there. Kind of get that impression on Facebook sometimes, right? Like, what's the moral crisis today, folks? It's like, what are we outraged about now? It's like, oh, it's over there now. We're going to go over here. Oh, I'm so mad at you. Oh, you're over there. I'm so mad at you. Even worse mad. You know, it's like it never gets anywhere because you're avoiding the real enemy, which is down lower, you know? And so they leave that part. And what's happening to them other than that? Like, there are insects biting them, right? Something like that, you know? So they leave that area. And to get to this other area, they have to cross the river Styx, right? They have to cross the river Styx. And the Terran's there, and he's feeding them with his oar if they go to sleep, right? But what ends up happening, right, is he says, I don't want you on my boat because you're alive. It's like, well, God wants it. It's like, okay, he's the boss. And so he goes on the ship, and he goes over. And now he goes into limbo, right? That's what it's called, limbo, isn't it? Yeah, limbo. And he goes into limbo, this city of the righteous pagans, is what it is, you know? And I mean, it's a pretty nice place, actually. It's all the people who live good lives that just didn't have baptism. Which is not unlike spirit prison, right? The idea of spirit prison, you know? The people who... But it's more than spirit prison, though, because really what it means, what this symbolizes is the state when you have good desires, but you don't have the right way to accomplish those good desires. You know, it's like Like, you remember Mosiah? You know, it's like what did Limhi do? You know, the guy who, the first Ammon, not the famous Ammon, but the other Ammon meets when he goes down. He's like, oh, I'm not going to let you into my city because I think you're one of the Noah's priests. And he's like, no, I'm not. I don't know who that is, right? And it's like, oh, come in. You're from Zarahemla? Come right in. And it's like, he goes and you can tell he's defensive, right? He's defensive and he's guarded, right? And you know lots of people who are imprisoned by negativity, mental illness, addiction, or whatever, they're negative. They're like, who are you? Do I let you in? Do I let my guard down? It's like, oh, you're from there? Okay, come on. You know, but really, that whole book of the Book of Mormon, Mosiah, is about captivity, about people who did nothing wrong. Their ancestors may have done something wrong, but people who are good, who are just imprisoned because of bad choices on the parts of the people who came before. And like, that's true of you too, just within your own life, because you could have made choices in the past, like made neural connections, right, that don't affect how you think now, right? You could, but you're still affected by the past. And the thing is that, well, that's what Christ came here to do. Christ came to free us from the effects of our bad choices in the past, the consequences of our sins, of our ancestors' sins. Because we do suffer from the effects of our ancestors' sins, by the way. We aren't punished for them, but we suffer from them, right? And anybody who is raised in a household or a family with a chain of abuse will know that, right? What does it say in the book of Exodus? It says, people who take the name of God in vain will be punished unto the third and fourth generation. My great-grandmother never touched my grandmother, never hugged her. And you know why? And my grandmother really never hugged my mom. And my mom actually isn't very good at touch either. But the reason my great-grandmother didn't touch is because she was abused by a guy down the street in 1920-something, right? A neighbor. It had 4-generation effects. I think we're just getting over it, like the Bible says. But it's awful. But that's what Christ came here to do. He came to free us. Another way to say that is referencing the Book of Mormon, right? Is that, well, we have to get the guards to sleep, right? Often, the moment when an addiction or a bad behavior stops, I've seen lots of stories about this, is the moment when you realize about to do something bad or whatever. Like there was this story I heard on a Swedenborgian YouTube channel. She said that she had this bad habit of going and smoking pot and doing bad things with friends. And she would find herself doing it, right? But she was reading a bunch of Swedenborgian books at the time. And she just felt something growing inside her. And she suddenly, when she was at the door, leaving to go, she says, as a voice in her head said, you have the opportunity to stop. You don't have to do this. You could stop if you wanted to. And so she stopped, right? It wasn't the last time she did it by any means. But cultivating those moments is key. Cultivating the moments when you have choice. And in essence, right, that's what happens all over in the Book of Mormon, especially in the first part where they put the guards to sleep with wine, right? Wine is a sacred substance. Wine is something that, at least in the Book of Mormon, they drink sacredly, right? That's what Dionysus drank. Wine is a sacred substance, and and we drank wine for the sacrament for a while, actually, I think, in the church. But wine is a sacred substance, and so they give the guards wine, and they get inebriated because they can't handle their liquor, so to speak. You know, it's like, but another way to say that, right, is that the evil can't understand the good, right? So if you do good things, the evil is put to sleep. They can't see it, right? That's the wine, that's the sacredness. And that puts them to sleep. It gets you to that moment when they don't have any control over you, you can make that choice, right? And so that's liberating you from limbo, liberating you from that. And this is actually more applicable to purgatory, probably, which we'll get to later. But it's liberating you from that state of the spirit prison. And so he leaves limbo and he goes across, and that's where Minos is, right? He has the snake coiling around him that tells you what level of hell you go to. And it's interesting because hell is arranged circularly, actually. Hell is arranged as something that has levels, but that it's a vortex, right? I think it's interesting that, I don't know if you noticed, but what direction does Dante go around the circle? What spiral direction? Anybody catch that? Toward the left or the right?
Would he guess right?
To the left, actually. But he goes right in heaven, actually. This is a fascinating thing deep into Swedenborg that I found, which is that actually the mind, he says, the spiritual form of the mind is arranged as a spiral. And if you are doing, like, it actually appears like a spiral form, like in Job, what does God appear to Job as? As a whirlwind, right? A swirling thing. That's what the chakras are. They're vortexes, right? And so what? But he says that the good is a movement from to the right. So it's going like this. That's goodness. It always goes up. The right goes up. But he says that evil is a movement towards the left. And that's what happens when you are going down into hell. And Dante got that. But it's interesting because, well, what is on the right hand of God? Like Jesus is on the right hand of God, right? So it's like it's moving up. It's like this, But what's interesting is that Dante, you catch this in La Vita Nuova, right? How he had that vision, that nighttime vision of the lady with fire. So you get the impression that Dante had these mystical experiences because, in a certain sense, the Divine Comedy is exactly right, actually. Like people who have nightmares or have bad trips or who have visions of hell, they report things like this, actually. Violent, macabre scenes that are symbolically appropriate to the sin. And that's something we should talk about. I think it's actually called this. I might be getting it wrong. I think it's contra. Tell me if it's probably not. Oh, so is that right? Is that right? Anyway, I'm going to erase that. But it's basically the idea that I'm probably getting that confused with something else. But it's the idea that the punishment for the sin is symbolically and poetically equivalent to the sin, right? You're not punished by something else. You're punished by something sleeping in the sin. Wickedness was never happiness.
It is controversial.
Okay, cool. But you see, that was me getting lost in the woods just there. I doubt it. And really, what's happening with this, like the people following the banner, they're always following the banner, right? They're always following a waving banner. They were when they were alive. And if you've ever, like for instance, has anybody? I've asked this before, but just raise your hand if you can distinctly remember hearing voices or seeing images on the edge of sleep. If you're okay, a few of you, okay, that's good. But the thing about those is that the reason you oftentimes don't remember them, and the reason why, right? Yeah, it's a falling. And that's an interesting case, right? You're falling asleep, right? But most of the time you don't notice them. And I think I realized that the reason you don't notice them is because they're just normal. Like Carl Jung had this idea that, actually it was a student of Jung who had this idea that dreams are happening all the time. Like right now you're dreaming, but you can't notice them just like you can't notice the stars at night. I mean, the stars during the day, you can notice the stars at night, right? And that's the thing is that when the sun goes away, it isn't that the stars are appearing,